I'm here today with Michelle Reyes. Michelle has a new book coming out called Becoming All Things, How Small Changes Lead to Lasting Connections Across Cultures, which is set to release from Zondervan on April 27th. Michelle is Vice President of the Asian American Christian Collaborative and the Co-Executive Director of PAX. She's also a scholar in residence at Hope Community Church. Michelle, it's so wonderful to have you here with us today. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me, Brian.
So I didn't say much about your background. Maybe you can expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So I am second generation Indian American, and my mother is 100% ethnically Indian. Although she wasn't born in India, she was born and raised in Uganda, Africa, and her great great grandparents were brought there as forced laborers to build the railroad by the British Empire, and
Wow.
just, stayed there long enough to start having families, settle down. So she grew up there and, so she grew up speaking Gujarati, Hindi, Swahili, English. But then it was in the 60s during the time of President Idi Amin that when President Idi Amin waged the genocide against Indians and other minorities in Uganda, that they fled with just the clothes on their back as refugees. And so, my mom eventually made her way to the United States and met my dad. And my dad is of British and German heritage. So he's blonde haired, blue eyed. And, so this is very interesting because for me, I've grown up at the intersection of those two worlds, and having both British and Indian heritage is such a unique mixture of histories of both the colonizer and the colonized. But in many ways, I've lived at the intersection of both worlds, majority minority culture, and so being aware of my cultural identity and how to connect with people of different cultures is just something that I became very attuned to from a young age, and just something that I've always been very passionate about. And so that in many ways is what in part led me to write the book that I do. A lot of the chapters open up with just stories of my life, stories of what it means to be an Indian American woman in the United States during this cultural moment, and the interactions that I've had with people of other cultures, the conversations we've had, the awkwardness, but also the beauty and the connections. And so that's just a little bit about me and my story and how it dovetails with the book.
So have you spent much time in London? Because there's a large, ethnic Indian population
Right,
there as well
right.
as obviously British.
Exactly. So yeah, some of my mom's family still lives in London. When they fled as refugees, they all went to England. Unfortunately, I've been to London, but I haven't met a lot of my mom's family, and it's
Mm.
because my mom grew up as a Hindu, but when she met and then married my dad, she converted to Christianity. She became a Christian. And that was a big no-no for her family. And so they
Wow.
disowned her. And so
Wow.
ever since that time, they have cut off ties and connections with them. So that is a hard part of my own life and stories. There's so many questions. I would love to meet my grandmother and talk to her about her life and her story, and hopefully maybe one day in God's
Yes.
timing and providence. But I have not yet met my grandmother and some of my aunts and uncles.
Well, that's sad to hear, but I mean, these things happen, right? I mean, it's
Yeah,
not unique.
yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the Asian American Christian Collaborative and then PAX and also Hope Community Church?
Sure. So the Asian American Christian Collaborative was co-founded by Raymond Chang and myself last year in, March of 2020. This was when anti-Asian racism was really rising in the United States. And whether it was my own friend group or just from what I was hearing nationally, there was a lot of hurt and frustration, particularly by Asian American Christians in their own churches, that as they tried to talk about this, they were dismissed or called snowflakes, or, any sort of conversations of larger interconnected, racism was denied. And so we really felt the need, we felt compelled to say something. And so we put out the statement on anti-Asian racism in the time of COVID-19. And within a few weeks, this statement garnered over 10,000 signatures. It really created national momentum, which we were very encouraged by,
Yes.
because it was written uh, by and for, largely for the church. And it was an invitation for how the church should be responding to anti-Asian racism. So it was circulated in churches, but also institutions and Ivy League schools and elsewhere. And so that statement is what catalyzed the beginning of our organization, the Asian American Christian Collaborative. Sadly, it felt like we were experiencing deja vu this past March, just a month ago, when, in the wake of the Atlanta massacre on March 16th, we put out another statement specifically to that as a way in which to reflect on where we've grown as a church, but also where we need to continue to move in terms of caring for Asian Americans in this country. And so we are a little over a year old by God's grace. And, we're wanting to be, a place that can mobilize the Asian American Christian voice by equipping people to understand race, faith, culture, and justice from a biblical perspective. And we have a Reclaim publication, a Reclaim podcast, and also doing advocacy on the ground in the wake of the Atlanta massacre. We were able to organize 14 prayer rallies in 14 cities across the country on Palm Sunday, and it was just a beautiful moment for the church to show up and say, we're going to collectively mourn and grieve together because of what's happening. So really grateful for that. As you mentioned, I'm also the co-executive director at PAX, and PAX is a Christian organization that serves to inspire and equip the next generation to pursue the peace of Jesus. And we do that through beautiful, slow, Jesus-centered content. So, juggling a few hats these days. And then on top of that, my husband and I, we are church planters in Austin, Texas. Our church is called Hope Community Church. And I serve as scholar in residence there, which means it's a fancy title to basically say that the majority of my writing and speaking opportunities and engagements it focuses on our church as a case study, if you will, and or my articles serve as resources for the church. And so, I'm going to be offering a course this fall or summer. We haven't decided yet, for the church on cultural identity development and cross-cultural relationships. So it's a really special way in which to intersect my professional work and vocational ministry.
Wow, it's wonderful to hear all the things that you're involved in.
Keeping busy these days.
Well, that's a wonderful thing. If you've got skills to contribute, it's great to be able to contribute them in multiple directions. So congratulations on all of that.
Oh, thank you.
And in the midst, you wrote a book and now you're launching it, right? So, that takes a lot of time too.
Yes, it does. It's very special to be at this point. As you know, book journeys are long. I signed my contract with Zondervan for this book 2 years ago, and so to be at this point where we're in the final home stretch it's really special.
Very cool. Well, speaking of your book and Zondervan, tell us a little bit about how that book came about.
Yeah, definitely. So, I found myself in recurring conversations, whether it was in church or online or at conferences, where I would be talking about cultural identity, cross-cultural relationships, and the resounding question that I kept hearing was, where do I start? And I understand the complexity of that question because, there's a lot of people who have tried already to connect across cultures and just have felt that they in their words, failed horribly, right? Like things didn't go well. They ended up accidentally insulting the person instead of building friendship. Or there's other folks who are just so fearful of saying or doing the wrong thing that they just haven't tried. And then on the other hand, you have particularly people of color who have now are carrying experiences of pain and trauma, even just frustration of some of these connections that just left them hurting and are no longer interested in continuing to try. And so people are all in different legs of the journey, if you will, when it comes to cross-cultural relationships. But I think that there's that continuing question of where do I start? What, how do I do this well and not like mess up, if you will? And so it was from those conversations and those questions that really I felt compelled to write this book and to use my own life and stories as a way in which to invite people along the journey. And also just the encouragement that we're gonna make mistakes. That I think part of the way we learn is by saying something and then learning, oh, okay, I'm not going to say that again, and pivoting. But basically, the foundation of my book comes from 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19 through 23. And in it, the Apostle Paul says, I became all things to all people for the sake of the gospel. And so this is the question I'm trying to answer in the book is, what does it mean to become all things to all people? And for Paul, in his context, he's talking about, I became like the Jew to win the Jew. And I became like the Greek or the Gentile, or as it says, those not under the law, to win those not under the law. And so I posed the question at the beginning of my book, if Paul was speaking to us today, he'd probably say something like, to the African American, I became like the African American. To the Latino, I became like the Latino, and so on. And so the question is, what does that look like? What is it about ourselves that needs to adapt and transform to connect with other peoples? And so the book seeks to answer that out.
Very cool. Well, in the book, you talk about encouraging people to discover and research their own cultural identity.
Yeah.
What does that mean, and why is it important?
Yeah. And so I start there because I truly believe that if we don't understand our own cultural identity about who God has made us as cultural beings, we won't be able to truly see other people in their culture and their context. And to take that a step further, if we're not able to truly celebrate who we are as cultural beings, we won't be able to celebrate the cultural identities of others as well. And so I lay the groundwork at the beginning of the book to show how our cultural identities and our spiritual identities are interwoven. I think too often Christians, we there's a few verses we use out of context, like Galatians 3:28, in which we quote, there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither male nor female, we're just all one in Christ, as a way to argue that our cultural identities don't matter. And so I'm seeking to provide a corrective to that and to look from Genesis all the way to Revelation as to why we should see ourselves as cultural image bearers and how that plays out in our faith and the way we live our life. And so, yeah, what I encourage folks to do is to just start seeing culture on a day-to-day basis. If you don't think about your cultural identity, whether you're at the grocery store or with your kids or at work, start thinking about, who am I? Who has God made me to be? How does this play out in my values, in the way I see the world, in the way that I view worship, and to really begin to have those conversations with friends, with family, to learn what it means to celebrate that. And from there, you'll have the right foundation for building connections across cultures.
Well, I mean, clearly in, America, Christianity is so seated in European culture, right? Historically, very deeply engaged, and all the assumptions that go with, that. And so, I think an important thing for all of us Europeans like myself is to really listen and understand the cultural differences and how that relates to spirituality and our faith, right, and everything with our lives. So how can people of different cultures see and value and listen to hear other people's stories?
Yeah, that's so great. Well, to your point, and that's something that I encourage as well for people who identify as white, right? Is that you have an ethnic heritage too, you're Dutch American or German American or Italian American, and there is beauty in that, and even diversity within that too. You could in the same way that if you lined up 10 Indians next to each other, we'd all be unique and different because we have different stories and backgrounds. The same would be true if you lined up 10 Germans or 10 Italians. And so we need to see the beauty and the way in which all of us are cultural mosaics. In terms of your question, I think there's a few good conversation starters that I think are helpful for anybody. And one is just simply asking people, what is your story, right? Instead of trying to like fit people into categories or stereotypes of what we think people are, just asking people, what is your story, and learning, being able to see the uniqueness of each individual. I think that's a very powerful question to ask. Um, and then also the question of what are your ethnic roots, and letting people self-define themselves, so that we can use language that is given to us. If someone calls themselves first generation or second generation, maybe they call themselves Black or African American. Some of my friends call themselves Indian. Some of them call themselves South Asian or Desi, right? So when we ask people, what are your ethnic roots, it gives people the opportunity to define themselves, and then we can utilize that language that best honors others.
Wow, very cool. Well, I think, there's a lot to be learned in your book. And so I know that everyone's looking forward to it coming out soon, April 27th. So
April 27th,
be here
yes.
before we know it. So I think you also mentioned that you're working on a second book. Can you tell us much about that at this point?
Yes, definitely. In fact, the manuscript is due next week. So in the
There you
final
go.
stages of that as well. But so I have a wonderful dear friend. Her name is Helen Lee.
Oh,
And
sure.
Helen Lee, oh, you know
No, I
Helen
know
Lee.
Helen
Yeah.
very well. Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely.
so we are co-authoring a book together,
Oh, wonderful.
and it's called The Race-Wise Family. And the subtitle is 10 Postures of Hope and Healing. And what we're hoping to accomplish in this book is to equip parents, Christian parents, with biblical foundations to everything from conversation starters to family activities to grow their children to do all these things that I'm sharing with you about how to develop our cultural identity, but even like how to respond to the news. When something tragic happens in our country, how do you have that conversation with your 10-year-old? Or how do you talk about language and what is appropriate, what is not appropriate? How do you talk about privilege? How do you talk about racism, or even what is biblically centered justice look like? So we just want to give a roadmap, a very practical roadmap for parents, because it's something that is very needed in this cultural moment. So that comes out with Waterbrook next year, early spring. And so we're really excited for that as well.
Excellent. That's wonderful. Well, I mean, I know Helen a lot because of her work at IVP,
That's right.
and she spoke at one of the Publishing and Color conferences a couple of years ago.
Oh, great.
So, so we've collaborated on a couple of different fronts, but also Compassion Christianity, which is another, entity that I lead, is developing a set of resources for parents.
Mm.
And so it sounds like, your book would really fit into that incredibly well.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, we're excited. It's been a special journey to co-author a book together.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I can imagine, the two of you working together really being outstanding results. So,
Oh, thank you.
so maybe we can do a three-way interview when that book comes out. I'll be
Hey,
looking forward to that.
that sounds great.
Well, Michelle, thank you so much for doing the work that you're doing and spending some time to share it with folks. I really appreciate that.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And we'll stay tuned for future books and future events. So
Sounds good.